Jeff Emmerich, the Abbey Road engineer we talked about a little bit, he once remarked that the Sgt. Pepper album, that all the songs, when they try to develop a concept for that album or a theme, he said that all the songs would flow from one to the next with no gap, as if the listener were present at a live performance. And in 1967, it was a radical idea. So, and I think you can, and adding on to that, you can see that there's definitely a shift in the sounds, and there's more experiments going on with their music after House. So starting with Sgt. Pepper and in the White Album. So what were some of the innovations in the recording studio that they were using, or some of the experiments that they were doing? What made them, or what's sticking around today as well? I guess to add on to that.
Yeah, well, a lot of what they did, people are still doing. Now we kind of take it for granted. It's just like standard record making practice. But it really goes back to their very first record, you know, when Lennon always insisted on double tracking his vocals, because he wanted that, you know, he said he didn't like the sound of his voice. But I think more to the point is that to give that kind of almost shouted kind of vocal sound is something that's all over the girl group records too. It just makes it sound more rock and roll. It gives the energy, there's a record a lot of energy. And so, you know, you record the whole record and then you go back and overdub yourself singing on every song. What a pain to do that. But he cared to do that to give it more of this recordy kind of sound. And then they just, you know, as they were able, they went more and more, they pushed the envelope with the Abbey Road engineers. Before Emmerich came, it was like those really straight-laced guys. They used to wear lab coats and ties, and they had books that would say, okay, what level do you set for this particular thing? And they look at the book, okay, then they said that that would be it. You know, you couldn't fool around with it. And the Beatles were always chafing against that. But when they really started to get, and other things that they did early on before they got really experimental, they would always play around with tape speed, record it at one speed and then play it back at another speed just to sort of change the tempo, change the timbre of the voices, you know. We're always goofing around with something. Over processing or over amplifying things so that they had an edge of distortion just to give it more of a rock and roll sound. But the really experimental record was the one before Sgt. Pepper's, and that's Revolver. And that's where, I think that's the first one where Emmerich came aboard, right? I don't think he was, what was the one before that? Rubber Soul.
Rubber Soul, yeah.
I don't think he did Rubber Soul. Anyway, somewhere right in that period, mid-60s, is when he joined up with them. And he was a young guy, you know, he didn't care about the Abbey Road rules, and he was willing to try all kinds of things. And you hear it all over Revolver. You know, there they got him working with tape loops, recording sounds backwards, if you know what that is, where you text you. In those days, now you just hit you backwards on your computer and it'll do it.
Right.
Those days you actually had to take the tape off, flip it upside down, and record the thing. Then you played it right side, it went like that. They did a lot of that. Lots of distortions, you know. I mean, really, if you listen to Tomorrow Never Knows, for example,
right.
Lennon's vocal is so distorted, they would put the voice through like Leslie speakers, which were designed for organ, not voice. And the main thing that they came up with for those sessions was something called automatic double tracking, which is a guy named Ken Townsend, who's an Abbey Road technician, came up with a thing so Lennon wouldn't have to keep double tracking his vocals. This thing would do it for you. It was basically a delay, but again, they didn't have digital delay in those days, so it was a project to create something. And he did it basically by having a variable speed oscillator, so that whenever you made an echo, you had to literally, whenever you had any kind of echo, it literally replicates a sound. So somebody's got to record a sound and then repeat it back. That's with digital. It's very easy because it samples it and boom, you know, you can set whatever delay time you want. Good. In those days, you know, they did echo, like for example on Elvis Presley records in the 50s, that rockabilly slapback sound. They did it by just going to another tape recorder and whatever the tape, that the gap was between the playback and record heads, and they'd feed the sound back in, and whatever that gap was would give you just that little gap of echo between the original sound and the repeat. But you couldn't really change it, it was what it was. So he came up with a way of setting up a variable speed oscillator on this other tape recorder where you could set the delay time all the way up to so close to the original sound that you couldn't tell it was an echo. It just sounded like a little thickener. And then with the oscillator, you could change the delay time further and further away until it finally got to be more and more like a hello, 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 hello. You know, I mean, only to a certain extent, but
Right.
within a certain range, you go from imperceptible echo to very perceptible echo. And so that was great. You know, they could set it, and Lennon could get his thing, and anybody who wanted to double track their voice didn't have to do it physically anymore. But because it was a variable speed oscillator, so it could go faster, slower, just by turning a knob. You could also get these weird effects, phasing and flanging and chorusing, because when you take that second, that echo, that repeat of the sound, and you change the relationship with the source sound, like this, repeatedly, you get that kind of, you know, it creates these kind of odd sound effects.
Right,
Well,
right.
when Harrison and Lennon found out about this, they would just sit in the control when they're doing the mix, and like I think Emmerich even says, they would like play the oscillator, and they would just be like making goofy sounds with it as they were mixing the track, you know. So all over that record, you hear all kinds of odd sounds that you don't hear on any Beatle records before that, and it's because, you know, they had really by then become, you know, that's when they stopped touring after they made that, and they became complete studio rats after that.
Right, right.
Yeah, and then Sgt. Pepper's was just like, okay, let's go. They had it all in mind now to do something that was this super ambitious record project.